Hello everyone, nice to be here again. I'm going to read another episode from my book, Experiences from Life. This is one of a trilogy. There's experiences from life, learning from life, lessons from life. We're up to persecution for righteousness' sake. First of all, Maurice preaches a little sermon and I've just done a little one-page précis of it, and then I'll go through how it affected me in real life. All that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. That's taken from 2 Timothy 3 verse 12. This is one of those promises which we usually leave out of the promise box. But we have to come to terms with it. Joseph was initially persecuted because he was his father's favourite and because of his God-given dreams. His own brothers hated him so much that they threw him in a pit and would have left him to die had not Judah persuaded them to sell him into slavery instead. David was persecuted and hunted down by Saul. Saul had no false accusations to bring against David, only the fact that God had chosen him. When David came upon Saul secretly in the wilderness and refused to kill him, Saul confessed to David, "Thou art more righteous than I." Yet Saul continued to persecute David and try to kill him. Enduring persecution is part of our calling and commission. Jesus sent his disciples out as sheep in the midst of wolves and told them they would be delivered up, scourged, persecuted, hated of all men. In other words, persecution is part of God's will, and we're always blessed when we're in God's will. Well, my talk is entitled, "The Servant is Not Greater Than His Lord." So, if that's the case, what should we expect? You know, I used to be terrified of my dad's anger, yet I seemed incapable of saying or doing the right things. I remember one time running to my bedroom hoping to escape the terrible battering which I probably deserved. He forced open the door which had locked against his entry, and in sheer panic I picked up the standard lamp and I began to smash all the bedroom windows with the base of it, screaming for help and for somebody to call the police. The adrenaline was rushing through me, and I knew as I lashed out wilder that something outside my control had taken over me. Dad must have seen it too, because it frightened him, and he backed out of the room telling my mother that I'd gone mad. Well, as he retreated down the stairs, I continued smashing the windows and screaming at the top of my voice until I had no more strength. I felt limp and exhausted as I slumped into my bed, and words came into my mind as God began to speak sense to me. "You won't remain a Christian if you stay in this house. You've got to get away. If you don't, you'll go insane." This is what God was saying to me. For a few years prior to this, I'd been running away from home and staying with various families who'd sheltered me, only to be brought back home again by the police at my parents' requests. There were times also when my parents threw me out, but then had second thoughts and called the police to bring me back home. Well, there and then, as I slumped on my bed, I prayed that even though I was underage, God would make a way for me to leave that house. And God must have heard me, because that's exactly what he did. My older sister, who'd emigrated to Australia a few years after her marriage, she'd written to my parents on numerous occasions, inviting them to do the same as she'd done and start their lives again in another country where nobody knew them. My parents had thought about it and dropped this idea every time, but now it took root and they actually went to the immigration authorities to sort out the matter. Their passage out there would have been easy if I hadn't been such a hindrance. I adamantly refused that I wouldn't go with them. For the past year, I've been putting down roots in my church. After all these years of being rejected and unwanted, I at last felt useful. And I think I would have walked over hot coals to keep the friendship and trust that was being offered to me by the minister. The immigration authorities told my parents that they'd either have to drop the idea of going to Australia for the time being or find a guardian for me. Well, they chose the latter option, and my minister signed all the necessary paperwork to become my legal guardian, or so he told me, and my parents could now relinquish all responsibility for me, and at last I could leave home with their consent. Well, everything was hunky-dory until something happened which stopped my parents pursuing their immigration plans. My mother, she always seemed terribly resentful of the fact that the most godly Christian she knew had become my ally. From her point of view, I can see how incredulous it must have been that somebody would take on such a self-opinionated, arrogant, rebellious, troublesome person as myself. But the confidence and trust that the minister put into me, it brought out loyalty and devotion which I never dreamed I could give. He knew I was lonely and had no friends, and he'd include me at every opportunity in his family circle. He confessed to me that even though my parents hadn't emigrated, he'd taken his commitment very seriously and prayed for me every day, as he did for each member of his own immediate family. I partook in the family worship and enjoyed the special treat of Saturday night supper when all his family, married and unmarried, would meet for laughter and serious conversation with real Mancunian shop-bought fish and chips wrapped up in newspaper. As my relationship with his two single daughters developed, we began to take holidays together, sometimes making these events special times of seeking God for spiritual growth. The minister's daughter, Liz, who was exactly the same age as me, she taught me some very valuable lessons. After graduating from university, she went to Germany to teach English to the German children in their schools. And whilst living in Germany, she'd made many friends and did lots of things with her newfound freedom. But when she returned home, she came back to live with her parents, which I thought was very strange. I'd expected her to rent a flat somewhere, as I'd done, and I knew she'd enjoyed her stay in Germany because of all the stories she'd told us, so I concluded she must be quite soft and unable to cope for any length of time on her own, or needed the support of a family around her. And I remember sharing my thoughts with her one day, and she was quite shocked. She put me straight there and then by saying that I was totally wrong. The reason for her returning home was that she enjoyed living with her parents. And this proved this statement over and over again in the things I personally witnessed her doing. You know, this was an unbelievable family. Lizzie's mother gradually became incapable of running the household due to osteoarthritis. So after a family discussion, it was decided that Chris, who was the youngest daughter, she'd stay at home to look after her mother and do the housework. And Liz, she'd go to work and be the main breadwinner, as the minister only received a very small income from the church. Liz had some splendid qualifications which enabled her to get some really good high-ranking positions. And each month she'd lay her salary before the family at their business meeting, and after paying the bills, food, etc., they would equally divide what remained amongst themselves as spends. It might only be £2 each week per person, but I know that her parents, in all their married life, they'd never before had money that they could call their own. This family was unbelievable. I spent more and more time with them, and their attitudes and lifestyle made such a deep impression upon me that they began to rub off, and my character, it gradually changed. I became less hard and aggressive, more willing and adaptable. And because the minister could talk of nothing but God, my desire for holy things grew beyond all recognition. I'd always had a good singing voice, but now God began to anoint it, and I had reports of people being filled with the Holy Ghost or healed as I sang. On the contrary, the family I was born into was so different from the Barratt household. We had an embarrassing track record for misconduct. My oldest sister and brother had terrible marital problems and had been divorced. My youngest sister had given birth to 4 illegitimate children, And I had a half-sister living a few blocks away, whom my father told me about after his conversion. I wasn't bothered that people expected the worst of me. I mean, after all, I'd come from immoral stock. But the scandal which surrounded me was rumoured by my own mother, who was telling everybody that the minister had always coveted me for his family, and I was now living with another woman's husband, as a couple from the church were supporting me so that I could voluntarily work for the church on a full-time basis. It was only a few months after I'd left home that God began to deal with my attitude towards my parents. And as I began to soften up towards them, I also tried to build up some sort of relationship. I used to visit them on Sunday afternoons, yet no matter how hard I tried to hold my tongue, we always ended up rowing. My mother was unreasonably jealous of the bond that had been forged between the Barratts and myself, and was constantly taunting me, saying that she, my mother, wasn't good enough and that I now had a new mum and dad. You know, I was working hard at this relationship and made great efforts to change my attitude. But this also incensed her, and she would sneeringly call me a little Barratt. The only true friends I had in the world at that point were the Barratts, and Mum's jealousy was just pushing me further towards them. It's so sad, really, because Mum could have been so proud of me. I knew many people my own age who left home and just used it as an excuse to go completely wild. Many of my school friends had ended up in trouble with pregnancy, drugs, or in crime. The world's an exciting place and offering many temptations. I was young, good-looking, and had no shortage of attention from worldly men who were willing to wine and dine me just so that they could come back to my flat at night. And I had to fight really hard to retain my Christian principles. It wasn't only my parents who criticised my relationship with the Barratts. I got plenty of criticism at work. Didn't take the bosses long to find out what I did in my spare time. And when I refused their advances, they would lecherously say, the minister must be onto a good thing. The fact that I kept stressing I didn't have a boyfriend and wasn't looking for a relationship seemed to make people think that I was either a lesbian or had emotional hang-ups. It used to frustrate me no end. I can't tell you how difficult it is to live a moral life in such a permissive age. I think too much television seems to have made people expect the worst of everybody. And they were always looking for the hidden dark secret that lay buried in me. Nobody believed me when I said I didn't want to get married, and yet that was the truth at that time. I believed with all my heart that God had given me a ministry, and I wanted him to have every opportunity to fulfill that destiny in my life. Well, at 32 years of age, God told me to change my surname to Barratt. I'd been 16 when I'd left home, and for 16 years I'd been part of this other family. And God told me that it was time now to legally recognise something that he'd done spiritually. This action caused problems. But God had already dealt with me and taken away the hatred and bitterness I once had towards my parents. So I knew that what I was doing was not out of spite, but in obedience to God. The stronger I felt the call of God, obeyed his specific instructions to me by changing my lifestyle to live holy and separate, the more people misunderstood and persecuted me. I'm not saying I always felt blessed when this happened, because I didn't. But I do know that I have the kingdom of heaven to look forward to, where all tears will be wiped away and we'll receive the comfort and love that we were denied down here. And if you can identify with anything that I've been talking about, don't give up. Don't give up. Because even Joseph's trial came to an end. And God joined my mum and dad and myself in the end. And we had a really good relationship before they died. And I'm so grateful to God for what he did. God bless you.